Hey guys, tonight we're tugging back the velvet drapes of history's grandest bedrooms. And I'll be honest with you, you probably won't survive this if you try to keep up with the sheer scandal, perfume and intrigue. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'll wait a second. Done? Cool. Oh, and while you're here, drop your city and what time it is for you in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is how much energy the royals and their chosen companions spent hiding their private lives. On one hand, you're told these queens were paragons of purity, guardians of their country's morals, women sculpted into marble by propaganda. On the other hand, behind heavy doors, on thick mattresses stuffed with down, or even in gardens under moonlight, they played games of desire that could topple ministers or win wars. You're walking with me into chambers where silk curtains cling with candle smoke and perfumes hang in the air and whispered names echo louder than trumpets in Parliament. Imagine a long corridor of history. Each door you pass has a name scratched on the plaque. Cleopatra, or Anne, Marie, Catherine. When you press your ear to each one, you don't hear silence, you hear laughter. Sighs, the shuffle of velvet slippers. For rulers, the bed wasn't just a bed, it was a throne of its own. Sex could be an act of devotion, sure, but more often it was a transaction, a performance, or even a weapon. When a queen allowed someone into her most private circle, she wasn't only giving away affection, she was granting access to influence, intelligence, and sometimes the very future of the realm. Let's pause on one historical fact here. In the court of France, the official royal mistress was an actual position. Not just a whisper in the hallway, her name was written into state documents, she had apartments, and she could openly guide policy. Picture that in today's context. Imagine your boss officially listing mistress on the org chart right under chief financial officer. That's the scale of openness, and also absurdity that we're dealing with. But here's the quirky bit. Some rulers built elaborate hidden passageways for their secret meetings. At Versailles, secret staircases behind panelling connected the king's apartments with those of his favourites. You'd think this was romantic, like a secret rendezvous. In reality, servants and guards knew perfectly well what was going on. The secrecy was more about keeping up appearances for foreign ambassadors and jealous courtiers. It was theatre, private, candle-lit theatre, but theatre nonetheless. And here's where the scholarly debate creeps in. Historians still argue, were queens truly free agents in their passions, or were they cornered into using intimacy as one of the few tools available to them? Take Elizabeth I. Some scholars claim she intentionally remained unmarried and cultivated flirtations as a political strategy, dangling suitors like chess pieces. Others suggest she might have had real affairs, just covered under layers of myth. We don't know for sure. The absence of proof is both frustrating and thrilling. It leaves you wandering down a corridor of locked doors, rattling the knobs, but never fully opening them. As you drift further into this story, you start to feel the weight of secrecy. You notice the tapestries aren't just pretty, they muffle subtle sound. You notice the candles aren't only for light. They cover the dark corners where someone might slip in or out unnoticed. In these palaces, silence and shadow were as important as jewellery and crowns. The royal bedchamber was both a sanctum and a stage, and for mistresses, stepping onto that stage could be the making or the unmaking of their lives. You think about the queens themselves. They were surrounded constantly, maids dressing them, advisors hovering, guards standing like statues. But the moment the curtains closed, their bodies became one of the only things they could truly wield as their own. Desire became diplomacy, passion became policy. A single night of affection might win loyalty from a powerful duke, or it might plant the seed of treason if jealousy took root instead. If you lean in, you can almost hear a muffled laugh from behind the first door. Cleopatra, perhaps, pouring wine into a Roman cup, eyes locked like daggers across the rim. But don't push it open yet. Tonight we're going to take our time. We're going to walk slowly down this hall, open each door one by one, and see how power and pleasure intertwined. For now, it's enough to understand the stage we're on. A palace at night, thick walls holding in scandal, the world outside none the wiser. So breathe in that heavy scent of incense, feel the velvet under your fingertips, and remember, you're not just a spectator, you're in the wings of the greatest drama history ever staged. The first door creaks open, and you're hit with a rush of perfume, rose oil, honey, maybe even a whiff of cinnamon. Cleopatra VII, last Queen of Egypt, doesn't just step into the story, she practically struts. You've probably heard the old cliches. She bathed in milk, she rolled herself in carpets, she seduced Caesar and Antony with her beauty alone. Cute stories, right? But the truth is slipperier. She wasn't just playing at romance. She was crafting survival in a world where Rome's appetite for conquest could devour Egypt at any moment. Her bedroom was a war room, and the sheets were as tactical as any battlefield map. Picture her on a barge floating up the Nile to meet Mark Antony. Silver oars dipping into the river, purple sails catching the wind, musician playing flutes. She's reclining on a golden couch, dressed as Aphrodite, the goddess of love. This isn't a date, it's a political performance. Antony, a battle-worn general, is suddenly placed in the role of lovesick suitor. And you're watching the way Cleopatra leans forward just so. Her laughter timed like a military drumbeat. She knows Antony isn't merely falling for her eyes. He's falling for the entire spectacle. One cold historical fact here. Cleopatra gave birth to children by both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Those children weren't just personal, they were bargaining chips, little flesh and blood treaties. A son named Caesarion tied her legacy to Rome's most famous general, though Augustus Octavian later had the boy killed. That's how dangerous the consequences of love could be, your own child becoming a political liability. Now for the quirky corner. Roman gossip painted Cleopatra as some kind of magical seductress who invented bizarre tricks to enthrall men. One tale insists she dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar and drank it, just to show Antony she could throw away wealth like it was nothing. Scientists today squint at this story. It's chemically questionable, to say the least. But it tells you how obsessed Rome was with framing Cleopatra as excessive, dangerous, almost supernatural. She was, in their eyes, less a queen and more a sorceress who could make generals betray their homeland for her smile. And here's the scholarly debate that lingers like incense smoke. Was Cleopatra truly seducing her way into power, or was she simply a highly competent ruler playing by the only rules Rome left her? Some historians argue she wasn't unusually manipulative. She was just as politically savvy as any man of her time, only judged differently because of her gender. Others hold on to the narrative that she bewitched Rome's strongest men. The truth is likely tangled somewhere in between. If you're standing in her chamber, you'd notice how deliberate everything feels. The polished floors catching the lamplight, the choice of jewellery, lapis lazuli, gold shaped like serpents, signalling Egypt's ancient heritage. Even the way she spoke mattered. She was said to know a handful of languages, so she could shift her voice depending on her audience. You'd hear her switch from Greek to Egyptian to Latin, each word another caress or command. And imagine Antony himself, supposedly this hardened general, reduced to writing mushy love notes and sneaking away from his soldiers just to spend nights with her. Rome's Senate fumed, painting him as a man enslaved by lust. But you can't shake the thought, maybe Antony wasn't just chasing her body. Maybe he saw in Cleopatra a mirror of his own ambition, a partner willing to gamble everything on one roll of history's dice. Think about the ripple effects. Cleopatra's so-called love life ends up shaping the very backbone of the Roman Empire. Her alliances with Caesar and Antony feed into civil wars that elevate Augustus, Caesar's heir, as the first emperor. Without her entanglements, maybe Rome would have stumbled down a different path. You realise, standing there in the perfumed heat of her chamber, that desire didn't just alter private lives, it bent the entire arc of civilizations. Still, her story comes with its shadows. The image of Cleopatra as the ultimate seductress, immortalised in plays and Hollywood films, is likely more myth than fact. Was she beautiful by Roman standards? Probably not. Roman coins show her with a hooked nose and sharp chin, but beauty wasn't the point. Charisma was. Presence was. She could walk into a room and make generals forget their strategies. And isn't that more dangerous than any sword? As you leave her chamber, you glance back one last time. She's reclining on a couch, eyes glittering, as though she knows you're watching from the future. Cleopatra isn't just a woman in silk, she's a strategist wrapped in perfume. A ruler who understood that sometimes the most powerful throne in the world is found not in marble halls, but between drawn curtains. The next door on our long corridor of whispered intrigue creaks open, and this time you step into a room that smells faintly of beeswax candles and polished wood. Russia's Catherine the Great is waiting for you, though to be clear, she's not rolling out of bed with a stallion as the nastier rumours insist. Let's get this out of the way early. The infamous tale about her and a horse, complete fiction dreamed up by her enemies after her death. Still, it clung to her name like burrs on velvet, proof of how dangerous it was for a powerful woman to take charge of her own private life. Catherine was born a minor German princess, and when she arrived in Russia to marry the future Tsar, no one expected her to outshine her husband. But her husband, Peter III, turned out to be, well, let's just say he preferred playing with toy soldiers in his chambers, rather than warming the bed of his ambitious young wife. So Catherine, practical as ever, began cultivating lovers. Some she adored, others were political allies with benefits, and in a world where women were usually pawns, she flipped the board, using her partners as pieces in her game of empire. Let's ground ourselves with a solid historical fact. Catherine had several long-term lovers, the most famous being Grigory Potemkin. Together they reshaped Russia, expanding its territory deep into Crimea and the Black Sea. He wasn't just a lover, he was her co-ruler in all but title. Their letters to each other still survive, a mix of passionate endearments and sharp political strategy. Imagine drafting love notes that also include troop placements and foreign policy. That was Catherine's version of pillow talk. And now the quirky detail you'll love. Catherine supposedly had a secret room in the Winter Palace decorated with erotic furniture, chairs carved with intimate scenes, tables shaped to encourage more than just dining. Scholars debate whether this chamber ever really existed, but the rumour was delicious enough to stick. The idea of an empress strolling through gilded halls by day, then slipping into an X-rated gallery by night, was irresistible to her critics. Whether true or not, it reveals how people projected their fantasies and fears onto her. Here comes the scholarly debate, wafting like pipe smoke. Did Catherine's sexual independence make her a pioneer of female autonomy? Or was she simply playing the same power games men had always played, only judged more harshly? Some historians argue her affairs were pragmatic alliances, others believe she genuinely relished passion and refused to be ashamed of it. The divide remains, and maybe that's the point. Catherine doesn't give you a neat box to put her in. She sprawls across categories, half legend, half flesh and blood ruler. If you stand by the edge of her bedchamber, you'd notice how carefully curated everything was. The portraits on the wall showed her in military dress, breastplate gleaming while the satin sheets whispered of vulnerability. A paradox in one room. She might recline with a lover, bare feet curled under furs, and then rise at dawn to sign decrees that would send armies marching. She blurred the line between seduction and sovereignty until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Enemies pounced on this. Pamphlets circulated across Europe, mocking her as insatiable, a woman who could never be satisfied, who replaced lovers like gloves. The cruelest story, of course, was the horse. The fact that anyone believed it, even for a moment, shows you how quick societies were to demonize a woman who wielded power through both intellect and intimacy. A king with a mistresses was expected. A queen with lovers was monstrous. That double standard carved her reputation as deeply as her actual policies did. But lean in a little closer, because here's the irony. Catherine's so-called scandalous bedroom life barely scratched the surface of her achievements. She modernized Russia's administration, corresponded with philosophers like Voltaire, and even attempted to reform serfdom, yet to this day, says you, people remember her more for her supposed appetite than for her cultural reforms. It's as if history itself chose to focus on her sheets rather than her scrolls. And yet, in a soft, almost comforting way, you sense Catherine wouldn't mind. She played with image as deftly as she played with politics. Maybe she understood that the myth of her erotic power, exaggerated or not, kept her unforgettable. Maybe she laughed at the horse story in some celestial afterlife, shaking her head at how small-minded her rivals were. Either way, she left her mark in both court records and gossip columns, which might be the most Catherine thing of all. As you leave her chamber, the air feels warmer, charged. You look back and see her silhouette at the window, pen scratching against parchment, perhaps a love letter, perhaps a military order. With Catherine, it was always both. And stepping back into the corridor, you can't help but wonder, were her lovers the lucky ones, or merely footnotes in her story? You walk a little farther down the corridor, your footsteps echoing softly on the stone, until you find a door framed in Tudor red and black. When you push it open, the room smells faintly of polished oak and candle soot, with a hint of the ink that once stained love letters. Sitting at the heart of it is Anne Boleyn, and she's not just adjusting a jewelled hood or smoothing a silk gown, she's rewriting the destiny of England with nothing more than her wit, her charm and the dangerous glimmer in her eyes. Anne wasn't born to be a queen. She was the clever daughter of a courtly family, polished at the French court, where she learned not just how to dance, but how to intrigue. By the time she caught Henry VIII's attention, she had all the tools: intelligence, wit, and the ability to hold back just enough to drive a king half mad with desire. Henry, already married to Catherine of Aragon, found himself obsessed with Anne, and here lies the seed of catastrophe. The historical fact is blunt. Henry's pursuit of Anne led to the break with the Catholic Church, the English Reformation, and the founding of the Church of England. That's not just pillow talk, that's entire centuries of religious upheaval sparked by a woman refusing to be a side piece. Anne told Henry no. She wouldn't be his mistress like so many before her. If he wanted her, he'd have to crown her, and Henry, stubborn as ever, was willing to defy the Pope to make it happen. Now for the quirky detail. While Anne and Henry were still in the throes of their long courtship, he showered her with gifts and letters. In one letter, he called himself her loyal servant. Imagine that, England's king, a man who saw himself as God's chosen ruler, humbling himself with the kind of puppy love you'd expect from a teenager, texting emojis at 2 a.m. Henry wasn't used to begging, but Anne had him dangling on her words like a fish on a silver hook. Here's where the scholarly debate sharpens like a dagger's edge. Did Anne truly love Henry, or was she simply manoeuvring for survival and power in a dangerous court? Some historians argue she was ambitious, her refusal carefully calculated to elevate her family. Others paint her as a woman genuinely caught in passion, swept away by Henry's attention until it was too late to retreat. The debate remains open because the truth hides in those smudged letters and broken promises. If you could stand at the edge of her chamber, you'd notice how much pressure hums in the air. Servants whisper outside, factions form in the shadows of the corridors, and Henry's obsession grows heavier with every passing year. Anne smiles at him across the table, but behind that smile you sense calculation. She knows the stakes. Every kiss, every laugh, every refusal isn't just romance, it's politics. And every hour she keeps Henry wanting is another hour she climbs higher, until there's no turning back. But the story isn't a fairy tale. Once Anne wore the crown, once she finally gave Henry her body and her hand, the weight of expectation crashed down. Henry wanted sons, a dynasty secured. Anne gave him Elizabeth, who would one day outshine them both. But at the time it wasn't enough. Whispers began. Anne was cursed. Anne was a witch. Anne was too bold in her speech. The same sharp wit that enchanted Henry at first began to grate on him. The line between lover and liability blurred faster than candle smoke in a drafty room. And then came the end, fast, brutal, unforgettable. Accused of adultery, incest, even plotting to poison the king, Anne was dragged to the Tower of London. Most historians agree the charges were fabricated, but truth mattered less than convenience. In May 1536, she laid her slender neck on a French sword dressed in grey damask, and spoke calmly of her loyalty to Henry even as he betrayed her. Imagine the stillness in that moment. The hush of the crowd, the glint of sunlight on steel, and then silence. Yet Anne's shadow never left England. Her daughter Elizabeth I grew into one of the greatest monarchs in history, the Virgin Queen who would rule alone and redefine the very image of power. You can almost hear Anne's voice carried forward through Elizabeth's, sharp, uncompromising, unwilling to play the role assigned. In that sense, Anne's bedchamber bargains were not in vain. They remade a nation. As you leave her room, you glance back at the polished oak bed, now empty, and the faint echo of a laugh that once snared a king. Anne Boleyn reminds you that desire is never just private. It can ignite reformations, topple faiths, and set crowns spinning. In her story, the line between love and execution was a razor-thin thread, and she danced upon it until it snapped. 5. The corridor grows brighter as you step onward, until the gilded door ahead nearly blinds you with its shine. You push it open, and suddenly you're standing in Versailles, the palace that looks less like a home and more like a diamond necklace spread across the French countryside. Golden mirrors, chandeliers dripping with crystal, corridors that never end. This is Louis XIV's world, the Sun King himself, and every corner of it is drenched in spectacle. By day, he staged ballets with himself as the lead dancer. By night, his private life was just as choreographed. though the audience was smaller and the whispers far louder. Louis XIV didn't just have mistresses, he practically institutionalized them. The maîtresse en titre, the official mistress, wasn't some casual fling hidden in shadows. She was granted apartments inside the palace, wealth, jewellery, and enough influence to sway politics. At Versailles, everyone knew who warmed the king's bed, and everyone watched to see whether her smile could make or break a noble's fortune. If you imagine mistresses as shadows sneaking down back corridors, erase that image here. In Louis's world, mistresses walked through gilded halls with their heads high. Let's lock in a historical fact. Louis's most famous mistress was Françoise Athénaïse de Rochechouart, better known as Madame de Montespan. She bore him several children, many of whom were legitimized and folded into the machinery of court politics. For years she was the glittering centre of Versailles, the woman whose wit and charm matched the king's energy. When nobles wanted favours, they bowed to her as much as to him. She wasn't just a lover, she was a gatekeeper. Now here's the quirky bit that makes you pause. Madame de Montespan got caught up in the infamous affair of the poisons. Rumours swirled that she attended black masses where priests slaughtered infants to secure love potions for her. Did she actually sprinkle magical powders in her rivals' drinks? Unlikely. But in an age obsessed with both scandal and superstition, the rumour spread like perfume on silk. Imagine Versailles, buzzing with gossip that the king's mistress dabbled in witchcraft. Even the Sun King had to step carefully when shadows clung too close to his radiant image. And here's where scholarly debate fans the flames. Was Louis XIV truly ruled by passion, or did he use his mistresses as tools to keep the nobility distracted? Some argue that his many affairs were genuine, fueled by his love of women. Others suggest he encouraged spectacle and gossip as a way to control his court. If the nobles were busy watching who entered the king's bedroom, they were too distracted to plot rebellion. Either way, his private life doubled as statecraft, a dance of silks and secrets that kept Versailles humming. Stand in the Hall of Mirrors for a moment with me. Candlelight bounces endlessly across the glass, doubling and tripling every flicker until it feels like stars have collapsed into this room. Behind these mirrors, secret passageways twist toward the king's private apartments. You can picture him slipping through, not alone but with whichever mistress currently held his favour. For the courtiers waiting outside, those mirrors reflected not just their faces but their ambitions. Who held Louis's heart tonight? Who might hold the next appointment or pension tomorrow? The atmosphere was so thick with intrigue you could practically taste it. Imagine dining at the king's table surrounded by hundreds of glittering guests, when you notice his hand brush subtly against Madame de Montespan's. That single gesture could set off a week of rumours, alliances, and jealous feuds. The politics of Versailles weren't always decided in council chambers. Sometimes they were decided by a smile across a crowded ballroom. Yet Louis, ever the Sun King, eventually tired of Montespan. He drifted toward quieter mistresses, most notably Madame de Maintenon, who became his confidant, and in secret perhaps even his wife. Where Montespan dazzled with wit and scandal, Maintenon soothed with calm devotion. That transition itself tells a story. Kings aged, passions cooled, and even the most theatrical ruler sought comfort over chaos eventually. But the image that lingers isn't of Louis dozing in his later years. It's of a younger king striding through the gardens of Versailles, fountains spraying in perfect choreography, while courtiers leaned forward to guess who might share his bed that night. His mistresses weren't merely ornaments. They were actors in his grand production, and their intimacy with the king became a kind of public performance. As you step back into the corridor, you feel the sticky sweetness of Versailles still clinging to your skin. Perfume, candle wax, powdered wigs, it all mingles into one thick cloud. Behind you, the palace keeps buzzing, mirrors glittering, fountains splashing, while the Sun King's shadow stretches long, reminding you that in some kingdoms, love affairs were never private. They were policy. The corridor turns softer now, less blinding than Versailles, though the air still smells of powdered wigs and roses. You open the next door and step into a salon buzzing with music, chatter, and the faint scent of tobacco smoke. Here sits Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, better known as Madame de Pompadour, the woman who transformed mistresshood into a full-blown career path. She wasn't merely Louis XV's lover. She became his confidant, cultural advisor, and unofficial Prime Minister of Taste. Pompadour wasn't born with a coronet dangling above her crib. She was the daughter of a financier, groomed for charm by her ambitious mother, and whispered about by fortune-tellers who declared she was destined to capture the king's heart. Imagine living your youth with that prophecy hanging over you. One day, you'll be the mistress of the most powerful man in Europe. No pressure, right? Yet she leaned into it. Jeanne studied literature, painting, theatre, and all the refined arts until she practically sparkled with polish. When she finally caught Louis XV's eye at a masked ball, she was more than ready. Here's your sturdy historical fact. Madame de Pompadour held her place as Louis's official mistress for nearly 2 decades, a feat almost unheard of in a court where novelty was currency. And even after their sexual relationship cooled, she stayed in his circle as a trusted companion until her death. That endurance alone proves her skill wasn't just in the bedroom, it was in the drawing room, the council chamber, and the theatre. Now for the quirky gem, Pompadour practically invented product placement before Instagram influencers existed. She had a porcelain shade of pink named after her, Rose Pompadour, still recognised in design circles today. She championed Rococo art, encouraged opera and theatre, and even had furniture styles named in her honour. Imagine being so iconic that entire art movements swirled around your aura of charm. She wasn't just draped in silk, she was the aesthetic of the mid-18th century. But let's not forget the scholarly tangle. Did Pompadour truly love Louis XV, or was she a master of adaptation, playing whatever role he needed? Mistress? Friend, therapist, art director? Some scholars insist their relationship was deeply affectionate, pointing to letters that show tenderness beyond duty. Others argue she was pragmatic, understanding that keeping the king's attention, whether through intimacy or companionship, was the safest way to secure her own power. The debate simmers, like candle wax refusing to harden. Picture her salon now, paintings leaning against velvet walls, harpsichords tinkling, poets and philosophers gesturing wildly as they argue over Enlightenment ideals. Pompadour glides between them, smiling, refilling wineglasses, whispering to Louis at her side. She wasn't content to be arm candy, she curated the cultural soul of France. The Encyclopédie, the Great Enlightenment Project, owes part of its survival to her patronage. In her orbit, ideas flourished as much as flirtations, and yet whispers never ceased. Her enemies sneered that she manipulated Louis, that she used her beauty and cleverness to drain France's treasury into frilly projects. Some accused her of weakening the monarchy by distracting the king with operas, while wars raged abroad. The irony, of course, is that Louis himself leaned on her, not because she clouded his judgment, but because she steadied it. In his later, gloomier years, Pompadour kept him entertained, reassured, and frankly less lonely. Step closer to her writing desk. You see neat stacks of correspondence, lists of plays to sponsor, sketches of new porcelain designs. Here's a woman balancing passion and practicality with almost inhuman grace. Even her relationship with Louis shifted smoothly from physical intimacy to platonic companionship, showing her talent for adapting to the inevitable passing of desire. That flexibility kept her in power when dozens of others would have been discarded. And here's the little irony. Pompadour's name became shorthand for mistresshood, yet her true legacy lies in books, paintings, and architecture. She cultivated the image of a glittering ornament, while simultaneously shaping France's cultural backbone. When you whisper her name now, it doesn't just echo in boudoir, it rings through libraries and museums. As you leave her salon, you catch her laughing, tossing a sly comment at a poet, while Louis watches her with weary but affectionate eyes. She wasn't just his mistress, she was his mirror, his anchor, his muse. And you realise that sometimes the most powerful act of seduction isn't in the bedroom, it's in convincing an entire kingdom that your taste defines an era. The corridor grows cooler now, almost austere. You push the next door open and step into a chamber lit sparsely, its air heavy with the scent of wax and ink rather than perfume. Sitting at a desk strewn with papers is Christina of Sweden, a queen who baffled and unsettled Europe because she simply refused to follow the script. She wasn't interested in marriage, children, or playing the role of a pliant female monarch. Instead, she built a reputation as brilliant, eccentric, and, depending on who you ask, delightfully scandalous. Christina became queen at the age of 6 after her father, Gustavus Adolphus, was killed in battle. Raised almost like a prince, she wore practical clothes, studied philosophy and politics, and insisted on being treated as an intellectual equal to the men around her. When you stand in her room, you notice the absence of silks and lace. Instead, the furniture feels sharp, utilitarian, more suited for debate than seduction. Yet seduction followed her right away, in the form of whispers and questions about whom she truly desired. Here's the historical fact: Christina never married. In an age when royal marriages were the glue of alliances, her refusal baffled her advisors. Instead of producing heirs, she abdicated the throne at 27, converted to Catholicism and wandered Europe as a free agent. Her departure shocked Sweden. One minute she was their eccentric queen, the next she was striding out of the palace in men's riding clothes, a crown left behind on the tell. Now for the quirky sparkle, Christina had a deep fascination with theatre, and she often staged elaborate productions in her court, casting herself in unconventional roles. She enjoyed cross-dressing, appearing in doublets and boots, which fueled gossip that she blurred not only the boundaries of gender, but also those of desire. Imagine her striding into a banquet dressed like a cavalier while ambassadors squirmed in their seats, unsure whether to bow, laugh, or take notes for their reports back home. Here comes the scholarly debate, humming like a low cello. Was Christina queer by modern terms? Some of her letters suggest passionate relationships with women, particularly her lady-in-waiting Ebba Spa, whom she called her bedfellow and beloved. Were these the coded words of lovers, or the flowery language of Baroque friendship? Historians still argue, leaning over the fragile parchment, as if it might whisper the truth if handled gently enough. Imagine Christina leaning over a letter herself, quill scratching, her words as fierce as her mind. She saw herself as above the ordinary expectations of women. Marriage, too binding; children, too distracting. She preferred philosophy, conversation, and the thrill of controlling her own destiny. In her court, she invited thinkers, scientists, and artists, turning Stockholm into a hub of intellectual energy, if not exactly romantic convention. Still, the rumours never stopped. People called her unnatural, unfeminine, even dangerous. And when she abdicated, those whispers followed her across Europe. In Rome, where she settled, she surrounded herself with artists and cardinals, continuing to blur lines. One day she might appear in flowing gowns, the next in martial dress. She became a living contradiction, a queen without a throne, a woman who refused womanhood as society defined it, a figure who seemed to live in the spaces between categories. If you're standing in her chamber now, you can almost hear her voice, sharp, mocking, intellectual. She'd probably tease you for being too cautious, for seeking neat answers where none exist. Perhaps she'd lean closer, eyes gleaming, and whisper something outrageous just to see your reaction. She thrived on provocation, and her sexuality, whatever form it truly took, was part of that performance. The irony is rich. Christina, often painted as scandalous for her refusal to conform, remains one of the few monarchs remembered more for her personal identity than for her political achievements. She altered the map of gender expectations centuries before modern debates, her life a question mark drawn boldly across the neat script of monarchy. As you step back into the corridor, you glance once more at her room. The candles burn low, the papers are scattered, and her riding boots rest by the door, as if she might at any moment pull them on and vanish again. Christina reminds you that power sometimes lies not in seducing others, but in seducing yourself with freedom, no matter what the world says. The corridor bends, and this time the air warms, heavy with incense and leather bindings from thick books. You open the door and step into a Spanish palace, where the walls loom darker, more severe than the gilded brightness of Versailles. Here the atmosphere feels weightier, Catholic piety pressing down like a velvet curtain, even as secret passions bloom in its folds. Behind these doors lies the harem-like structure of mistresses and favourites who once shaped Madrid's court, their whispers threading as deeply into politics as prayers into cathedrals. You picture the kings of Spain, solemn, devout, their portraits showing downturned mouths and stiff armour, yet their private lives buzzed with contradictions. Officially, Spain was a champion of Catholic morality. Unofficially, mistresses carried titles, lands, and enough influence to re-erect entire policies. If you lean close enough, you can hear confessionals filling not only with sins of ordinary citizens, but with the tangled secrets of kings and their lovers. Here's the solid historical fact. Philip IV of Spain, who reigned in the 17th century, fathered at least 30 children, though only a handful were legitimate. His mistresses included actresses, noblewomen, and courtiers' wives, each stepping into his orbit for a time before fading into rumour, Among them, Maria Calderon, known as La Calderona, became infamous not just for bearing the king a son, but for eventually abandoning court life to join a convent. That son, Don Juan José de Austria, grew into a political force himself, proof that bedroom alliances could ripple across generations. And now for the quirky sparkle. La Calderona wasn't just a mistress, she was also a stage actress, a profession frowned upon by polite society. Imagine the pearl-clutching nobles, the King of Spain, defender of the Catholic faith, sneaking behind curtains to see not just a play but the woman on stage. The gossip practically wrote itself. Some whispered she used theatre masks and disguises for their meetings, adding a touch of comic absurdity to the otherwise grim Spanish court. Here's the scholarly debate still simmering in dusty archives. Were these mistresses truly powerful players in shaping Spanish politics, or were they disposable distractions for kings bored with ceremony? Some historians argue that women like Calderona wielded real influence, not only as mothers to royal bastards, but as voices in the ear of monarchs who trusted them more than ministers. Others push back, suggesting their role was exaggerated by the gossip pamphlets, hungry for scandal. The truth probably lies in the tension. Mistresses were both pawns and power brokers, depending on the moment. Stand in one of those chambers now. The walls are covered with dark tapestries, saints gazing sternly down while, in the middle of the room, a velvet couch plays host to whispers that could shake the empire. You can imagine a king kneeling not before a crucifix, but before a lover's smile, confessing not sins but fears of rebellion in Portugal or unrest in the Americas. In a land that stretched across oceans, sometimes the most secure anchor for a ruler's mind was the warmth of a mistress at midnight. Still, secrecy mattered. Spain's rigid Catholic image meant these affairs had to be cloaked in layers of discretion. Unlike in France, where mistresses paraded through gilded halls, Spanish favourites lived in half shadows, both acknowledged and denied. A mistress might ride in a carriage with curtains drawn, her face glimpsed only for a second, leaving courtiers to speculate endlessly about her power. That tension between the sacred image of the crown and the sinful reality of the bedroom gave Spanish scandals their uniquely hushed, suffocating flavour. And yet mistresses influenced art too. Philip IV's reign saw Diego Velázquez painting court portraits, works that captured not only the stiffness of monarchy, but also the subtle human weariness beneath. Some scholars suggest that the atmosphere of intimate gossip coloured the way Velázquez depicted his patrons. Tired eyes, weary gazes, a sense that behind the armour lay men more tangled in personal drama than military glory. As you leave this chamber, innocence lingers, mixing with the faintest whiff of powder and wine. Spanish mistresses may not have strutted openly like their French counterparts, but they were no less potent. Their shadows lengthened across both court and chapel, proof that even in the most pious halls desire could not be banished. It simply wore darker clothes. The corridor grows quieter now, its torches flickering with a gentler glow, as though even the walls are holding their breath. You push the next door and step into Elizabethan England, where the air feels sharper, scented with parchment and damp stone. This chamber belongs to Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen. And here the great contradiction hums, a monarch who wrapped herself in chastity as armour, while letting whispers of romance ripple through her court like the rustle of silks. Elizabeth inherited a throne draped in danger. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had lost her head. Her sister, Mary I, left a kingdom torn by religion. Elizabeth had to craft her image carefully. Marriage would mean ceding power to a husband, so she proclaimed herself married to her people, a virgin bride of the nation. But even as she polished that image, courtiers and ambassadors whispered about the men who circled her like moths, the most enduring flame. Robert Dudley, the dashing Earl of Leicester, whose closeness to Elizabeth became the stuff of both romance and scandal. Here's your historical fact. Robert Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, died suddenly in 1560, found at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck. Whispers shot through England like wildfire. Was it an accident? A suicide? Or had someone, maybe even Dudley himself, arranged her death so he could marry the Queen? Elizabeth never did marry him, perhaps because she knew the shadow of that death would taint her reign forever. Yet she kept Dudley close, gifting him palaces, honours, and the kind of intimacy that stopped just short of coronation. And here's the quirky tidbit. Elizabeth adored elaborate court masks, performances full of allegory where she often played the goddess Diana, chaste and untouchable. Picture her striding onto a stage glittering with jewels, embodying divine virginity before an audience that secretly wondered which nobleman she'd been laughing with after midnight. It was political theatre at its sharpest, flirtation as national strategy. Scholars still argue over the heart of it all. Did Elizabeth remain a virgin in truth, or was the title Virgin Queen simply brilliant propaganda? Some historians believe she held to celibacy as a matter of practicality, keeping suitors dangling without ever committing. Others speculate she may have had discreet affairs, hidden so well they left no evidence. The debate is unsolvable, a candle flickering endlessly in drafts of speculation. If you sit quietly in her chamber, you can sense how carefully she choreographed her relationships. She let Dudley close enough to spark rumours, but not close enough to trap her. She toyed with foreign princes, Philip of Spain, the Duke of Anjou, dangling the possibility of marriage to secure alliances before pulling back at the last moment. Every stare, every glance, every gift of a jewelled locket was less about desire than diplomacy. Elizabeth turned her own body into the ultimate bargaining chip, not by giving it away, but by refusing to. Yet the loneliness seeped in. Letters show her frustration, her moments of vulnerability. She often called Dudley her eyes, suggesting a trust deeper than politics. But the throne's weight demanded distance. You can imagine her lying awake, lace collar loosened, staring at the canopy above, wondering what it would have been like to live as simply Elizabeth, not Elizabeth Regina. Perhaps she envied her ladies-in-waiting, whispering together about their crushes, free from the burden of empire. And still she made the myth work. Her virginity became her brand, painted into portraits where she appeared ageless, untouchable, half divine. In a world where women were dismissed as weak, Elizabeth weaponized purity into power. She bent the expectations of gender into something no one could challenge, a woman untouchable by husband, pope, or parliament. When you leave her chamber, you notice the sharp contrast between the whispers and the silence she cultivated. Elizabeth's legacy isn't in who she did or didn't take to bed, it's in how she convinced her nation, and perhaps herself, that love could serve as theatre, desire as strategy, and chastity as a crown. The Virgin Queen may or may not have been a virgin, but she was certainly no fool. The corridor tilts toward a fevered hum now, as though the very walls are vibrating with gossip. You open the next door and stumble into 18th century France, where pamphlets litter the floor like autumn leaves, and each scrap is a dagger pointed at Marie Antoinette. The air reeks of ink, sweat and scandal, not the perfumes she adored. This is the room where truth and rumour blurred until the Queen of France became less a woman and more a caricature, painted with every salacious brush her enemies could find. Marie Antoinette arrived in France as a teenager, a pawn of dynastic marriage. She was meant to secure peace between Austria and France, but instead she became the most hated woman in Paris. Part of that came from her spending habits, her diamonds, her gowns, her elaborate hairstyles stacked like frosted cakes. But much of it came from the imagined orgies that Parisian pamphleteers claimed filled her nights. The scandal sheets accused her of sleeping with women, with courtiers, with guards, even with her own son. It didn't matter whether any of it was true, what mattered was that people believed it. Here's the historical fact you can cling to in this storm. In reality, there is no solid evidence Marie Antoinette ever had lovers. Her closest male friend, Count Axel von Fersen, may have been her confidant and perhaps something more, but historians still debate whether their relationship was consummated. The torrent of accusations came less from her actions than from the need to demonize her. Now the quirky bit, one pamphlet so widely circulated it practically became street theatre, described Antoinette participating in wild lesbian orgies in Versailles, lounging with courtesans in costumes that would scandalise even modern cabaret. It was pornographic propaganda before the internet, cheaply printed, easily shared, devoured by the public with the same appetite they had for bread. Imagine wandering through Paris and finding a crude cartoon of your queen pinned to a tavern wall, her reputation shredded for a laugh. And here lies the scholarly debate, burning hotter than candle wax. Was Marie Antoinette simply an unlucky target of misogyny and xenophobia, an Austrian outsider hated for her foreign birth? Or did her frivolity and obliviousness fuel the fire? Some scholars defend her as a scapegoat for France's deeper economic crises. Others argue she did little to help herself, embracing lavish balls and extravagant gowns even as her people starved. The debate makes her life a hall of mirrors, guilt and innocence endlessly reflecting. If you sit in her chamber, you'd see both sides at once. On her writing desk, carefully folded letters to her family show a tender, almost naive woman longing for home. On the dressing table, a tower of powdered wigs and diamond necklaces suggests someone playing queen like a role in an opera. And in the shadows by the window, you can almost hear the laughter of pamphleteers sharpening their quills, ready to turn any gesture, a smile, a dance, a glance, into evidence of depravity. Imagine her evenings at Versailles. The palace glittered with mirrors, but those reflections only multiplied her loneliness. She gathered her intimate circle at the Petit Trianon, her private retreat, where she played shepherdess and surrounded herself with loyal friends. To her it was escape. To the pamphlets, but it was proof of debauchery. Every action was twisted, every sigh turned into scandalous music for the mob. The tragedy, of course, is how those rumours followed her to the guillotine. During her trial in 1793, prosecutors accused her of incest with her young son, a charge so grotesque it shocked even the Parisian crowd. Marie Antoinette, once accused of orgies and frivolity, responded with a quiet dignity, appealing to all mothers in the room. It didn't save her. The pamphlets had already done their work, softening her into a villain the revolution could easily cut down. As you leave her chamber, the paper scraps crunch beneath your shoes. Each one is a lie, an exaggeration, a fantasy, but together they built a reality that ended with her head falling into a basket. Marie Antoinette's secret sex life may have been mostly fabricated, yet the power of rumour proved deadlier than any affair. You glance back once more, and in the candlelight you see not a decadent queen, but a fragile woman, smothered beneath gossip thick as smoke. The corridor hums with a different rhythm now, the shuffle of silk replaced by the tap of boots on parquet floors. You open the door and step into a world of smoky cabarets, spiced perfumes, and whispered espionage. A woman in glittering jewels and veils turns her head toward you. Mata Hari, the courtesan who became myth. Her real name was Margaretha Geertruida Zell, but the persona she crafted, Mata Hari, Eye of the Day in Malay, was the one that captivated soldiers, diplomats, and audiences across Europe during the chaos of World War I. She wasn't born into glamour. Raised in the Netherlands, she married young to escape an unhappy childhood, only to find herself trapped in a violent marriage in the colonies of the Dutch East Indies. But she learnt the power of reinvention there, watching Javanese dancers, absorbing their movements, and later weaving them into her own performance style. By the time she returned to Europe, she had transformed herself into a fantasy, a so-called exotic princess from the East, bearing her body in theatrical dances that Paris and Berlin ate up with ravenous delight. Here's the solid historical fact. During World War I, Mata Hari was accused of being a double agent, spying for Germany while pretending loyalty to France. Arrested by the French in 1917, she was convicted and executed by firing squad. The evidence against her was flimsy at best, but her reputation as a seductress sealed her fate. In the eyes of the court, a woman who bewitched generals could just as easily betray a nation. And now the quirky sparkle, her performances often included a dramatic reveal where she shed layers of jewelled costumes until she wore little more than a jewelled brassiere and veils. She sometimes claimed she danced naked, but in truth she often kept her breastplate on because she was self-conscious about her smallpox scars. Even in her most scandalous moments, vanity and vulnerability mingled. Audiences didn't notice, they were too busy believing the fantasy. Here comes the scholarly debate. Was Mata Hari truly a spy, or was she merely a scapegoat? Some argue she passed on trivial bits of information to both sides, but never had the access to be a serious intelligence threat. Others believe she knowingly manipulated her lovers, using pillow talk to gather details she sold to the highest bidder. The truth may be that she was less a master spy, and more a woman caught between nations eager to blame someone for their losses. Picture her boudoir at a Paris hotel. The room smells of incense and cognac, lace curtains drawn against the grey light of war. On her bed lies a general's uniform coat, abandoned in haste. At the vanity, Mata Hari adjusts a veil, her eyes lined with coals, practicing the same gaze that once made diplomats melt. Was she thinking of espionage, or was she simply planning her next performance? For her, the boundary between performance and life blurred until even she may not have known which was which. Her downfall was swift and merciless. The French press devoured the story, painting her as a serpent who seduced officers into spilling secrets. At her trial, prosecutors practically treated her lovers as evidence of treason. It didn't matter that many of the men she bedded had little to do with classified intelligence. The idea of a foreign temptress in silk sheets was irresistible. When the bullets fired on that October morning, Mata Hari reportedly blew a kiss to her executioners. Even in death she performed. The irony is cruel. A woman who built herself into a myth was destroyed by the same myth. Today, historians look back and see less a dangerous spy than a woman punished for her sexuality, her independence, her audacity to rewrite her life. Yet the legend persists, because Mata Hari represents a fear that never fades. The fear of a woman who knows her power and dares to use it. As you close her door, you can still hear faint music, the sound of veils rustling, the clink of champagne glasses. Mata Hari leaves you with a truth as sharp as a bayonet. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun or a codebook, but a glance across a candlelit table. The corridor chills again, frost curling at the edges of the torches. You push the next door and a gust of icy wind slips out, carrying with it the smell of birchwood fires and fur-lined cloaks. This chamber belongs to the Russian Tsarinas, the women who reigned behind onion domes and snow-covered palaces, where power and passion melted together in ways both intoxicating and dangerous. The stories of their private lives blur into legend, not least because Russia, vast and secretive, loved to wrap its rulers in both splendour and rumour. Take Catherine I, widow of Peter the Great. She had risen from obscurity. Some say she was once a laundress, others claim a servant, before catching the Tsar's eye. Her intimacy with him gave her unprecedented influence, enough to outmaneuver courtiers and secure the throne after his death. Imagine it, a woman who once scrubbed linens crowned as empress, her ascent powered not by lineage but by love and shrewd survival. Her chamber would smell less of perfumes and more of sweat and ambition, the faint aroma of someone who refused to be erased. Here's a sturdy historical fact. Russia's imperial court often revolved around informal favourites, lovers of both Tsars and Tsarinas who wielded as much power as generals. Empress Anna, for example, kept Ernst Johann von Biron at her side, showering him with titles and wealth while he ruled in her shadow. These men weren't always admired, many were hated, but their presence shaped policy as much as the empress's decrees did. In Russia, the bed and the throne were often side by side. Now for the quirky sparkle, Empress Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great, was notorious for her enormous wardrobe. She owned thousands of gowns, so many that servants reportedly had to reinforce palace floors to hold the weight. The gossip also whispered that she delighted in surrounding herself with handsome guards, the so-called choir of beautiful men. Were they simply eye candy, or did some become more intimately involved? The line between uniform and lover blurred under her reign, making her court feel more like a fashion runway with benefits. And here's the scholarly debate. Were these Tsarinas truly exercising sexual autonomy, or were they trapped in a system where intimacy was another tool for survival in a ruthless court? Some historians argue women like Catherine I or Elizabeth wielded genuine power, choosing lovers as freely as any Tsar. Others counter that these choices were shaped by necessity, with women clinging to favourites to secure alliances in a world that would happily swallow them alive. The debate lingers like frost smoke on a cold morning. Picture a winter night in St. Petersburg. Snow heaps against palace windows, the Neva River frozen solid. Inside, a candle-lit room glows warm, heavy with furs draped across chairs. The Empress lounges with her chosen favourite, perhaps sipping sweet kvass while courtiers scheme in icy hallways. A whispered endearment here, a kiss on the hand there. These moments ripple outward into decrees, promotions and dismissals. To the common people, the Empress is untouchable, divine. To her lover, she is flesh and warmth, capable of changing destinies with a sigh. But shadows always gathered. Russia's court was a nest of knives. Lovers who rose too high often fell with a crash. Von Biron, Anna's cherished companion, was dragged from bed after her death, exiled to Siberia in disgrace. Catherine V's humble origins remained a sore point for nobles who despised her power. And Elizabeth's beautiful men drew sneers from courtiers who whispered that her passions weakened the throne. In these stories, intimacy was both a crown and a curse. As you stand in the room, you hear the muffled strains of orthodox hymns from a distant chapel, blending with the laughter of courtiers nearby. Russia's duality presses on you. the holy and the scandalous, the divine and the fleshly. The Tsarinas lived in that tension, their sex lives both condemned and weaponized, both hidden and impossible to ignore. When you step back into the corridor, the frost clings to your skin. You leave behind a palace where fur-lined secrecy cloaked passions as fierce as any battlefield. The Russian Tsarinas remind you that in a land of endless winters, the warmth of intimacy could be both salvation and downfall. The corridor darkens again, lanterns flickering low, and when you push open the next door, a wave of warm spice and heavy musk drifts out. This isn't the silken velvet of Versailles, or the frosty discipline of St. Petersburg. It's the intoxicating world of the Ottoman Empire. Here, the harem is not just a private retreat, but a labyrinth of politics, pleasure, and peril. The women inside are not idle ornaments. They are tacticians whispering through latticed screens, deciding futures with a nod or a caress. At the heart of it all stands the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, whose power often eclipsed ministers and generals alike. Picture the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, sunlight glinting off domes while peacocks strut in the courtyards. Beyond the gates, hidden behind latticed windows, the imperial harem thrums with its own rhythm. Eunuchs guard the doors, their loyalty absolute, while women in jewelled robes glide silently through corridors. Some are concubines selected for their beauty or wit. Others are rivals, plotting to outmaneuver each other for the Sultan's favour. And presiding over them, like a spider at the centre of a jewelled web, is the Valide Sultan, whose influence could topple viziers or sway imperial campaigns. Here's the historical fact. Hurrem Sultan, also known as Roxolana, rose from being a concubine of Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century to becoming his legal wife, a shocking move that broke centuries of Ottoman custom. She bore him children, advised him in politics, and corresponded with foreign rulers. Her letters reveal a woman both affectionate and calculating, a partner whose bedchamber conversations shaped the empire as surely as any council meeting. And now for the quirky sparkle. Some concubines used coded perfumes as secret signals. A particular scent of rose oil or ambergris might indicate a request for privacy, a warning, or even an invitation. The harem was a world of language beyond words, fans fluttering, glances exchanged, oils dabbed carefully onto skin. Imagine walking through those chambers, your nose overwhelmed, each fragrance a hidden sentence in a secret dialogue. Here's the scholarly debate that won't quite rest. Was the harem primarily a gilded prison or a platform for female influence? Western travellers often described it as a cage of beautiful captives, but modern historians point out that many women there wielded immense power, controlling patronage networks, education, and even military appointments. Some argue the harem was less a prison than a political school training women in the delicate art of influence. The truth, like incense smoke, shifts depending on where you stand. If you pause in the chamber, you can hear laughter from a distant room, young concubines rehearsing songs or poetry, hoping to catch the Sultan's attention. At the same time, you catch the sharp hiss of older women whispering about alliances, their voices edged with rivalry. A girl's beauty might win her a night with the Sultan, but survival required far more: wit, timing, and allies. For every concubine who rose to prominence, countless others faded into obscurity, their lives swallowed by silence. Imagine a moonlit evening at Topkapi. Suleiman walks through scented gardens, jasmine blooming thick, while Hurrem strolls beside him, her veil glinting in the lamplight. Their fingers brush bambouille, and courtiers watching from a distance know that tomorrow's decisions, in war, in law, in diplomacy, may already be sealed in this private exchange. Desire and empire are intertwined so tightly, you cannot tug one without unravelling the other. But the danger is constant. A Valide Sultan could rule like a queen one year, and be poisoned the next. Eunuchs might switch loyalties, and jealous rivals could stir plots. The harem was both sanctuary and battlefield, its walls soaked not only with perfume but with paranoia. Yet through it all, the women carved space for themselves in an empire that otherwise offered them little public power. As you close the door, the spices linger on your tongue: cinnamon, clove, rose. The Ottoman harem leaves you with the uneasy realization that desire, when entwined with ambition, can build an empire's heartbeat as surely as cannons or treaties. Behind veils and lattice work, the empire's most intimate politics played out, their echoes carrying far beyond the silken beds. The corridor warms again as you walk onward. This time not with incense or candle soot, but with the faint smell of gunpowder, leather boots, and wine spilled on maps. You push open the next door and step into the tempestuous world of Napoleon Bonaparte and his first wife, Josephine de Beauharnais. The chamber feels alive, humming with their fiery mix of passion, betrayal, and power, the kind of love that shakes an empire until its marble cracks. Josephine wasn't a wide-eyed girl plucked from obscurity. She was already a survivor when she met Napoleon. Born in Martinique, she married young into French aristocracy, only to see her first husband guillotined during the Reign of Terror. She narrowly escaped the blade herself. By the time Napoleon stumbled into her orbit in the late 1790s, Josephine was a seasoned widow, worldly, and endlessly charming. Napoleon, young, ambitious, and still rough around the edges, fell headlong into her spell. Here's your historical fact. Josephine and Napoleon married in 1796, and their relationship was torrid from the start. Napoleon, away on military campaigns, wrote her passionate letters that bordered on obsessive, filled with longing, jealousy, and theatrical declarations. Meanwhile, Josephine, perhaps less consumed, entertained affairs in Paris, fueling gossip that raced faster than any courier could gallop. Their marriage was as much a war as any battlefield Napoleon commanded. And here's the quirky sparkle. Josephine adored roses and cultivated one of the most famous rose gardens in Europe at Malmaison, her private estate. She sponsored botanists to collect specimens from across the globe, turning her bedroom reputation into a horticultural empire. Imagine Napoleon returning from conquest to find his wife not waiting in silk sheets, but strolling among exotic blossoms, more devoted to petals than to generals. Her roses, in the end, outlived both their marriage and his empire. Now the scholarly debate. Did Josephine truly love Napoleon, or was her attachment primarily pragmatic, marrying the young general for security and riding his meteoric rise? Some historians see in her letters genuine warmth, tempered by a survivor's instinct never to trust fully again. Others argue she was always calculating, balancing her affection with a keen sense of self-preservation. And Napoleon himself? He swung wildly between idolizing her and raging against her betrayals, never entirely free from her grip even after divorce. Picture a night in their Paris home. Napoleon, short-tempered and restless, paces by the fireplace, his boots creaking against the floorboards. Josephine lounges on a chaise draped in silk, her laughter soft but edged, as if she knows the power imbalance isn't as lopsided as it looks. She lets him rage, lets him pour out jealousy, then tilts her head and melts the storm with a single smile. In this room she's the general, and he's the soldier obeying orders, but history, cruel as ever, demanded heirs. Josephine could not give Napoleon the son he craved to secure his dynasty. Despite his passion, despite the roses, despite years of devotion, he annulled their marriage in 1810. It broke him more than he'd admitted. He remarried, of course, to Marie-Louise of Austria, who bore him the longed-for heir. Yet even then he kept Josephine's portrait, spoke her name, and carried her memory across battlefields. When he died in exile on St. Helena, a locket of her hair was found among his possessions. And here's the irony. Josephine's daughter from her first marriage, Hortense, became the mother of Napoleon III, who would later rule France. The Bonaparte dynasty Napoleon dreamed of securing through a new wife ended up flowing through Josephine's line anyway. She outmaneuvered him in death, as she had so often in life. As you leave their chamber, you can almost hear the scratch of Napoleon's pen on paper, writing yet another fevered letter. I love you, I hate you, I adore you. Josephine smiles faintly in the background, tending her roses, her gaze steady, her silence louder than his declarations. Their love was less a quiet flame and more a cannon blast, loud, smoky, destructive, but impossible to forget. The corridor softens as you walk, and the air fills with the faint scent of lavender and coal smoke. You push the next door and step into Victorian England, a world of polished wood, heavy drapes, and portraits that scowl down with moral superiority. At the centre of the room sits Queen Victoria, her crown heavy, her reputation severe, but her heart, her heart is not the prim, laced-up relic her statues suggest. Here you find a woman whose private passions ran deeper and fiercer than the stiff etiquette of her court would ever admit. Victoria was crowned at 18, a teenager suddenly draped in ermine, and the crushing expectations of an empire that spanned the globe. At first, she leaned heavily on advisors and her domineering mother, but when she met Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, everything shifted. Their marriage in 1840 wasn't just dynastic convenience, it was a thunderclap of passion. Victoria adored Albert with an intensity that embarrassed some of her ministers. She wrote in her diary on their wedding night that their union was heavenly, and the glow of that night lingered for decades. Here's your historical fact. Victoria and Albert had 9 children together, a dynasty sprawling across Europe's royal houses. Their marriage was unusually affectionate for the time, full of private tenderness that rarely seeped into public view. Yet while Albert was her anchor, he was also her equal in bed and in council, a balance rare in a monarchy where queens were expected to defer to men. And now the quirky sparkle Victoria had a healthy, unabashed appetite for sex, something her era preferred to sweep under lace doilies. She once complained that Albert was sometimes too tired for her demands, which is saying something for a man juggling empire, family, and reform projects. Imagine the irony. The woman remembered as a prudish symbol of moral rigidity actually adored intimacy, scribbling diary entries that radiated desire. The Victorians built her into a statue of restraint, when the reality was much steamier. Here comes the scholarly debate. Was Victoria's passion for Albert entirely personal, or was it also political? Some argue she used her image as a devoted wife to counterbalance anxieties about female rule. Others suggest she truly couldn't separate her emotions from her reign, that her love was raw, personal, and overpowering, not calculated. The debate rests in the contrast between her fiery letters to Albert and her stern public proclamations of duty. Imagine one of their evenings at Windsor Castle. Outside, the fog drapes the Thames in silence. Inside, candles flicker, casting warm shadows over the carved bedstead. Albert pores over plans for exhibitions or reforms, while Victoria leans close, teasing, laughing, sometimes petulant, always craving his attention. She wasn't a quiet, submissive spouse. She was needy, passionate, quick to anger, and quicker to forgive when he soothed her. Their marriage was full of quarrels, but their reconciliation often came in ways the stiff-collared Victorians would never dare whisper about. And then came the shattering silence. Albert's death in 1861. Victoria plunged into mourning so deep it became her identity. She wore black for the rest of her life, demanded her servants lay out Albert's clothes each day, as if he might walk back into the room, and retreated from much of public life. Her grief was so consuming that critics accused her of neglecting her duties, but even in her absence her legend grew, the widow queen devoted eternally to her lost love. Yet grief had its complications. Rumours swirled about her closeness with John Brown, a Scottish servant who became her confidant. Was he a friend? A secret lover? Some of her children bristled at his influence, and caricatures mocked her as Mrs. Brown. The truth remains hazy, another scholarly debate with no firm answer. But whether platonic or passionate, her bond with Brown shows a woman who, even draped in mourning, still craved intimacy and companionship. As you step back into the corridor, the lavender lingers, mixed with the coal-tinged breath of Victorian London. Queen Victoria's public face was carved in stone, stern, moral, unyielding. But behind the curtains, she was alive with desire, devotion, and grief so deep it remade her image forever. She leaves you with the reminder that even queens built into myths of duty and restraint are, at their core, creatures of passion. The corridor narrows now, its lanterns burning with a faint golden glow, until you reach a door painted crimson and black. You push it open and step into the forbidden city of Imperial China, where silence feels heavy, almost sacred. The air is perfumed with sandalwood and jasmine, and the vast courtyards outside are eerily still. This is not the open chatter of Versailles or the noisy pamphlets of Paris. This is a palace where whispers could mean life or death, and where concubines turned the emperor's bed into a battlefield. The forbidden city was a world within a world. At its heart lived the emperor, the son of heaven, whose touch was considered divine. Surrounding him were hundreds of women, empress, consorts, concubines, and attendants, each ranked meticulously in a hierarchy as rigid as the palace walls. On the surface it looked like luxury, silks, jade ornaments, banquets served on lacquered trays, but beneath the surface simmered rivalry, schemes, and poison-laced tea. And here is your historical fact. The Qing dynasty maintained a strict system for selecting concubines known as the Draft of Palace Maidens. Every few years, beautiful and virtuous young women from across the empire were brought to Beijing, inspected and chosen for service. Their fate depended on a glance. One girl might catch the emperor's attention and rise to power overnight, while another might spend her life in quiet obscurity, never once called to his chambers. And here's the quirky sparkle. The emperor's nightly schedule was carefully recorded, down to which concubine he visited and when. Attendants would present him with ivory or silk plaques engraved with the women's names. The emperor would select one, and the chosen concubine would be bathed, perfumed, and ceremonially carried, sometimes literally, into his bedchamber. Yes, carried. She'd be wrapped in silk sheets and transported to him like a parcel of desire, a ritual that was as absurd as it was symbolic. The scholarly debate is thornier than the rose gardens at Versailles. Were these concubines truly powerless pawns, or did they wield influence from behind the screen? Some historians argue they lived as virtual prisoners with little chance to shape their destiny. Others point out that certain women, like Empress Dowager Cixi, clawed their way from concubine to absolute ruler of China, proving that the bedchamber could be a stepping stone to the dragon throne itself. The truth lies somewhere in the shifting shadows. For every forgotten concubine, there was one who mastered survival and turned intimacy into authority. Imagine a night in the Forbidden City. Snow falls softly outside the vermilion walls. Inside, courtiers shuffle silently. Eunuchs bowing low as they escort a chosen concubine through endless corridors. She is terrified not just of the emperor's gaze but of her rivals watching. A single night of favour could elevate her family back home, or condemn her to envy and sabotage. When she finally reaches the emperor, candles flicker against gilded screens painted with cranes and lotus flowers. Desire here is wrapped in ritual, but beneath the ceremony lies raw human yearning and fear. Rivalries were brutal. Concubines might sabotage each other with poisoned food, cursed charms, or whispered slander. Some accounts tell of women smothered in their sleep, their deaths hushed away as accidents. The stakes were too high for kindness. If a woman bore the emperor a son, her position solidified, and her family's status soared. If she failed, she risked fading into irrelevance, forgotten in the labyrinth of courtyards until she was old and invisible. And yet, amid the danger, there was beauty. The gardens bloomed with peonies, nightingales sang, and poetry circulated within silk-draped chambers. Some concubines became patrons of art, calligraphy, and theatre, leaving behind works that hint at their inner lives. Imagine a woman painting delicate orchids by the lamplight, her brush steady even as her future trembled. Through art, they spoke in ways history tried to silence. As you close the heavy lacquered door, the faint scent of sandalwood clings to your skin. The Forbidden City leaves you unsettled, both awed by its grandeur and chilled by its cruelty. Here, intimacy was not private but political, woven into rituals that made the emperor a god and his lovers both worshippers and sacrifices. Behind those crimson walls, desire was never simply love. It was destiny, sharpened to a knife's edge. The corridor grows heavier as you approach the next door, shadows clinging like incense smoke. You push it open and step into Renaissance Rome, where marble saints stare down from ceilings while, in the dim corners, whispers bloom like mould. This chamber belongs not to queens but to popes, the men sworn to celibacy, draped in robes of holiness, yet tangled in the same lusts as any king. Here, mistress and Madonna blur, and the Vatican itself becomes a stage for scandal. Popes were supposed to embody spiritual purity, but history has never been tidy. During the Renaissance especially, papal mistresses strutted boldly through Rome. Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, is the most infamous example. His relationship with Vannozza dei Catanei produced several children, including Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, who would grow into legends of ambition and scandal in their own right. Imagine a pope, shepherd of souls, also fretting about whether his teenage son was managing his troops effectively. Here's your hard historical fact. Alexander VI openly acknowledged his children, married them off strategically, and used them as pawns in the ruthless chessboard of Italian politics. That's not just a whisper, it's documented reality. For him, fatherhood and papacy overlapped shamelessly, and now for the quirky sparkle, Pope Sixtus IV, who built the Sistine Chapel, was rumoured to sell church offices to fund lavish weddings for his many nephews, whom critics claimed were actually his illegitimate sons. The irony is rich. You tilt your head back, gazing at Michelangelo's frescoes, while knowing the very roof overhead may have been financed by papal nepotism wrapped in family drama, holiness and scandal painted on the same ceiling. The scholarly debate still burns. Were these papal mistresses and children simply tolerated as an open secret of the Renaissance? Or did they actively undermine the credibility of the Catholic Church? Some historians argue everyone knew and accepted it, shrugging as long as the sacraments flowed. Others insist this hypocrisy fueled the Protestant Reformation, with Martin Luther's fury aimed as much at papal bedsheets as at indulgence sales. The truth is tangled, desire and doctrine intertwined like ivy on marble. Imagine walking through a Vatican corridor in the late 15th century. Candles flicker, cardinals whisper in Latin, and just beyond a closed door you hear laughter that doesn't sound very saintly. A mistress waits in silk, her hair perfumed, her role unspoken but undeniable. The same hands that bless the masses in St. Peter's Square might have just traced her cheek an hour earlier. The duality is dizzying: public chastity, private indulgence. Of course, not every pope was a libertine. Some were ascetic, others indifferent. But the ones who indulged left the deepest stains. The Borgias especially became the symbol of papal corruption. Incest rumours, poisonings, midnight feasts that blurred into orgies. Were they exaggerated? Absolutely. Enemies love to embellish. Yet behind the exaggeration lies truth. The Vatican was no monastery of saints, but a palace where power mixed freely with passion. Think of Lucrezia Borgia, often painted as a femme fatale. In reality, she was more pawn than player, her reputation warped by the propaganda. But the very fact that she could be imagined as a poison-wielding seductress shows how much her father's lifestyle shaped perceptions. The papal bedchamber was never private. It was political ammunition, hurled across Europe by rivals eager to expose hypocrisy. And yet, amid the scandals, art bloomed. Raphael painted Madonnas, Michelangelo carved Pietas, and Bernini sculpted ecstasies so sensual they blurred the line between religious devotion and erotic pleasure. You can almost hear the unspoken laughter. Perhaps the Renaissance popes understood that the same human passions fueling lust could also fuel beauty. In that sense, their mistresses were part of the same current that birthed genius. As you close the Vatican's door behind you, the incense clings to your clothes, heavy and sweet, masking the musk that still lingers beneath. The Pope's mistresses remind you that even those who claim divine celibacy cannot escape human desire, and sometimes that very hypocrisy reshaped the faith of half the world. The corridor curves and suddenly opens into a room filled with candlelight bouncing off glassy water. You hear the splash of gondolas outside and smell salt and damp wood mixed with perfume. You've stepped into Venice, the floating city, where courtesans were not merely lovers but cultural celebrities, wielding wit and beauty as weapons sharper than any blade. This chamber doesn't belong to queens or empresses. It belongs to the women who made Venice hum, the courtesans draped in silk who could outthink senators and outlast scandals. Venice was a city built on contradictions. It cloaked itself in Catholic piety while thriving on trade, indulgence and spectacle. Courtesans flourished here because they filled a role nobody dared speak of openly, yet everyone sought. They were confidants, entertainers, muses, sometimes spies, and occasionally more politically connected than the Doge himself. Step into a Venetian salon and you'd find laughter, poetry readings, lute music, and the most influential men of the city leaning closer to hear a courtesan's every word. Here's your historical fact. Veronica Franco, one of Venice's most famous courtesans of the 16th century, was not only celebrated for her beauty, but also respected for her poetry. She published volumes of verse, corresponded with nobles, and defended women's rights in her writings. Imagine a mistress whose pillow talk included reciting sonnets, whose influence extended beyond the bedroom into the realm of literature and politics. And here's the quirky sparkle. Venetian courtesans were sometimes mistaken for nuns from a distance, thanks to the similar veils they wore. It wasn't uncommon for a traveller to step off a gondola, spot a veiled woman, and only later realise he had stumbled not into a convent, but into a courtesan's salon. Venice blurred the line between sacred and profane so thoroughly that you could walk 10 paces and pass from prayers to passion without noticing. The scholarly debate circles like water around pilings. Did these courtesans truly wield power, or were they simply indulged until their beauty faded? Some historians argue they were trailblazers, carving out independence in a patriarchal society by monetizing their wit and charm. Others counter that their freedoms were precarious, always at the mercy of clients' whims and the state's moral crackdowns. Veronica Franco herself was eventually dragged before the Inquisition, accused of witchcraft, proof that the same society that praised these women could turn on them savagely. Picture one of their salons. The air is thick with incense, the clink of crystal goblets punctuating bursts of laughter. A courtesan reclines on a velvet couch, her gown shimmering in candlelight, while senators and poets gather at her feet. She tosses out clever remarks, sparring in wit, her intellect as dazzling as her jewels. Somewhere outside bells toll from St. Mark's, but in this room time bends and there courtesan reigns. Yet the glamour carried shadows. Courtesans live precarious lives, always balancing admiration with suspicion. A rival could ruin them with a whisper. A wealthy patron might abandon them without warning. Still, many of them secured fortunes, estates and legacies. Some trained in music and art, becoming patrons themselves. Others, less fortunate, slipped into poverty once their beauty waned, their names erased from memory except in police records. And yet, Venice adored them. Even as priests railed against immorality, the city's very identity was tied to the courtesan's allure. Tourists came for gondolas and masquerades, but they left with stories of women who seemed half goddess, half devil. Courtesans were woven into Venice's mythology, just as essential to its spirit as the canals and bridges. As you close this watery chamber, you hear the soft splash of oars and the faint echo of laughter trailing down an alley. Venice leaves you with the sense that seduction here was not scandal, but survival, not sin, but art. The courtesans remind you that sometimes the most powerful women are not queens with crowns, but those who carve kingdoms out of silk wit and candlelight. The corridor chills again, and when you open the next door, it is as if a storm has been trapped inside. The lamps flicker with a bluish light, and the air reeks of incense, candle wax, and something darker, like earth after rain. This is the chamber of Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna of Russia, and her entanglement with the mystic who scandalized a crumbling empire, Grigory Rasputin. Their story is part devotion, part manipulation, and part grotesque rumour, stitched together into the final tragedy of the Romanovs. Alexandra, German-born wife of Nicholas II, entered the Russian throne with high hopes and heavy burdens. Deeply religious and painfully shy, she was never beloved by the Russian public, who mistrusted her foreign origins and cold demeanour. Then came her greatest trial. Her son Alexei, heir to the throne, was born with haemophilia, a condition that turned every cut into a mortal threat. Alexandra's desperation for her child's survival opened the door for a man like Rasputin. Here's your historical fact. Rasputin, a Siberian peasant turned holy man, gained Alexandra's trust because she believed he could heal her son. Reports suggest that during Alexei's crises, Rasputin's presence and his strange methods of prayer and calm sometimes coincided with the boy's recovery. Whether by chance, hypnosis, or sheer psychological influence, Alexandra saw him as a god-sent saviour. Now the quirky sparkle, Rasputin was rumoured to have a truly hypnotic gaze, so intense that women reportedly fainted when he looked at them. He claimed his healing power came through physical closeness, often blurring the line between spiritual guidance and sexual exploitation. In St. Petersburg, high society ladies whispered at late-night prayer sessions that looked suspiciously like orgies. Whether exaggerated or not, Rasputin leaned into the image, cultivating both holiness and scandal like twin flames. And here's the scholarly debate. Was Alexandra Rasputin's lover, or was their relationship strictly spiritual? Historians remain divided. Letters from Alexandra to him read with alarming intimacy, calling him our friend, and my dear one, filled with God's grace. Critics at the time interpreted these words as evidence of an affair, yet many scholars today argue that she was simply pouring maternal desperation and mystical faith into her words. The ambiguity remains, like candlelight that never quite reveals the corners of the room. Picture Alexandra's private chamber. The Tsarina kneels before an icon, lips moving in desperate prayer. Behind her stands Rasputin, his hand raised, chanting in a low voice, his presence both comforting and unsettling. For Alexandra, he is not a man, but a vessel of hope, the one lifeline keeping her fragile son alive. Outside the palace, however, rumours spread that the Empress was bewitched, her body enslaved by a peasant sorcerer. In a country already teetering on revolution, those rumours became dynamite, and Rasputin, he revelled in the chaos. He wore filthy robes yet dined with aristocrats. He preached repentance while boasting of his conquests. He claimed sin was the path to grace, which conveniently excused his drunken escapades with the women in St. Petersburg's shadowy corners. His enemies despised him, not only for his influence over Alexandra, but for the way he embodied the empire's corruption. They saw in him proof that the Romanovs were rotten, ruled not by divine right but by a drunken monk's whisper. The scandal grew unbearable. Satirical cartoons painted Alexandra and Rasputin in grotesque embraces, hinting at adultery that shook the monarchy's fragile legitimacy. Was it true, or was it merely the projection of a society desperate to topple a dynasty? Either way, the damage was real. By the time Rasputin was murdered in 1916, poisoned, shot, and drowned in one of history's most dramatic assassinations, the Romanovs' reputation was already beyond repair. Imagine Alexandra's grief when she heard of his death. She saw not a debauched monk, but her child's protector, her spiritual guide. In her mind, the empire had lost its only shield. Months later, the revolution would sweep her and her family into captivity and execution. In hindsight, Rasputin's shadow seems woven into their downfall, his name forever linked with their ruin. As you close this chamber, the incense clings bitterly in your throat. You leave behind a woman desperate for miracles and a man who blurred holiness with hunger. Their story reminds you that in times of despair, intimacy, real or imagined, can become both salvation and poison, and sometimes history cannot tell the difference. The corridor shifts beneath your feet, as though you've crossed into a different kind of palace, one without crowns or ermine, but with marble columns, chandeliers, and press cameras waiting at every door. You push open the next door and find yourself in a parlour that feels oddly familiar. Washington, D.C., home of America's first ladies. Here the atmosphere hums differently. There are no harems, no official mistresses parading like courtiers. Instead, there are whispers tucked into cocktail parties, rumours printed in newspapers, and the ever-present tension between public morality and private longing. The United States never crowned queens, but its first ladies became royalty of a sort. They were scrutinised for their dresses, their smiles, and especially their marriages. On the surface, the role was ceremonial. Behind closed doors, it was a crucible of secrets. Eleanor Roosevelt, Jackie Kennedy, even more recent figures, each carried reputations polished by a public image while the gossip mills churned endlessly about what happened when the cameras clicked off. Here's the historical fact. Eleanor Roosevelt formed a famously close bond with journalist Lorena Hickok, a relationship documented in thousands of surviving letters. Many read with romantic tenderness, though scholars debate whether the relationship was sexual or simply intimate friendship. Still, the existence of those letters shows that even in the austere halls of the White House, emotions bloomed outside the lines of traditional marriage. Now for the quirky sparkle, Grover Cleveland, long before his presidency, was entangled in a scandal over a child born out of wedlock. His opponents taunted him with chants of "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" during the 1884 election. He admitted financial responsibility but denied paternity, a murky response that didn't exactly clear his reputation. The punchline? He still won, and his supporters shot back with, "Gone to the White House, ha ha ha." Even in America's supposedly puritanical politics, scandal could be spun into victory. Here comes the scholarly debate. Do the private passions of America's leaders and their spouses really matter? Or are they distractions from policy? Some argue that affairs and secret romances erode public trust, revealing hypocrisy. Others counter that personal lives are irrelevant so long as governance remains steady. The divide shows America's peculiar mix of Puritan roots and tabloid appetite. For every sermon about family values, there's a magazine cover speculating about who slipped out of whose bedroom at midnight. Picture a White House evening in the 1960s. Jackie Kennedy hosts a glittering dinner, chandeliers shimmering, musicians playing softly. At her side, President John F. Kennedy smiles for photographs. Yet the whispers are everywhere. His affairs with actresses, secretaries, even rumoured trysts with Marilyn Monroe. Jackie smiles serenely, her poise unshaken, but behind the elegance lies a private battlefield of humiliation, negotiation, and sheer endurance. Here, the role of mistress is rewritten for modern times, hidden in shadows but never fully erased. First ladies carried their own rumours too. Edith Wilson, Woodrow Wilson's second wife, was accused of effectively running the government after his stroke in 1919. Her power came not from scandalous romance, but from intimacy turned into regency. Meanwhile, Florence Harding, wife of Warren G. Harding, endured gossip about his alleged illegitimate children and affairs, even as she navigated his presidency. In America, mistresses were never official, but they were always present, lurking in the margins of political history. And yet, unlike the courts of Europe, America's gossip rarely crowned mistresses as cultural icons. Instead, it treated them as threats to the national image. The idea of democracy clashed with the spectacle of royal-style affairs. So rumours were hushed, denied, or buried under patriotic rhetoric. Still, the fascination persisted, proving that even in a republic, the bedroom remained part of the stage, and as you leave this chamber, the chandeliers flicker, and you catch the faint rustle of reporters' notepads, the ghostly flash of a camera bulb. America's queens and their hidden lives remind you that monarchy isn't required for scandal, just human hearts beating restlessly beneath the weight of public expectation. The corridor brightens with a golden glow as you approach the next door, the air tinged with beeswax and roses. You push it open and find yourself once more in Versailles, though the Sun King, Louis XIV, is older now, his glory mellowed into ritual. This chamber doesn't belong to him. Not directly. It belongs to his daughters-in-law, the princesses married to his sons and grandsons, women whose bedrooms were as closely watched as battlefronts. If Versailles was a theatre of power, these women performed their roles beneath a relentless spotlight, where gossip moved faster than candle flames and could ruin reputations before dawn. Picture the endless corridors, mirrors gleaming, and servants scurrying with trays of hot chocolate at midnight. The daughters-in-law, Marie Adélaïde of Savoy, for instance, wife of the Duke of Burgundy, were expected to embody virtue and fertility. Their pregnancies were public events, their loyalty measured in sons. Yet beneath the starched gowns and powdered wigs, they were young women caught in the same currents of desire, envy, and intrigue that swirled through Versailles like perfume. Here's your historical fact. Marie Adélaïde, vivacious and charming, quickly became a favourite at court. She lightened Louis XIV's mood during his last years, bringing laughter back to a palace burdened with mourning and age. Her marriage was affectionate by arranged standards, and her wit gave her unusual influence. But her sudden death from measles in 1712 devastated the king, proof of how quickly Versailles could shift from celebration to tragedy. Now the quirky sparkle, Versailles gossip was so rampant that courtiers sometimes read gazettes filled with the latest scandals. Handwritten newsletters passed from hand to hand. These proto-tabloids reported on who was seen leaving whose chamber at suspicious hours, who lingered too long by a fountain, or who adjusted their wig just a little too flirtatiously during supper. Imagine nobles huddled in alcoves whispering the 17th century equivalent of celebrity gossip blogs, with the princesses often at the centre. And here's the scholarly debate. Were these women active players in Versailles' sexual politics, or were they pawns caught between the king's mistresses and the ambitions of their own families? Some historians argue that women like Marie Adélaïde cultivated charm and flirtations deliberately, wielding influence with a subtle hand. Others suggest their reputations were shaped entirely by the gossip machine, exaggerated until the real women vanished behind caricatures. The debate leaves you wondering how much of what we know about their lives is reality, and how much is just rumour gilded in gold leaf. Stand for a moment in one of their chambers. A princess reclines on a chaise, silk skirts spilling across the floor while ladies-in-waiting fan her ressort. She whispers about her husband's stiffness, or perhaps about a flirtation with a courtier who makes her laugh. Outside, footsteps echo, and she lowers her voice. At Versailles, even laughter could be dangerous. If the wrong ears heard it, it might be spun into scandal by morning. The competition was ruthless. A daughter-in-law might earn the king's affection, but that meant jealousy from mistresses and rivals. A misplaced smile could be read as seduction, a missed glance as betrayal. The palace magnified everything until small gestures swelled into epics of intrigue. Imagine living where every move was dissected, your private life woven into a tapestry of gossip that reached across Europe. Yet, despite the suffocating scrutiny, these women carved moments of rebellion. Some cultivated salons where they hosted writers and philosophers, finding intellectual refuge. Others turned to discreet romances, the kind hidden in shadowed alcoves or hurried glances during masquerades. The daughters-in-law of the Sun King may have been gilded pawns, but they were pawns who sometimes learned to move sideways on the board. As you leave Versailles again, the mirrors seem to follow you, reflecting not just faces but rumours, doubling and tripling them until truth disappears. The daughters-in-law remind you that sometimes history remembers women less for what they did than for what others whispered about them. In the Grand Theatre of Versailles, scandal was always waiting in the wings. The corridor feels hushed now, the golden glow fading into something more austere. You push the next door and find yourself stepping onto tatami mats in a chamber that smells faintly of incense and cedar. The sliding screens open just enough to reveal paper lanterns casting soft pools of light. You've entered the world of the Japanese imperial court, where concubines once shaped dynasties from behind delicate fans and painted lips. This isn't Versailles with its glittering mirrors. It's Kyoto or Edo, where silence carried weight and desire moved in gestures as small as a flicked sleeve. In Japan, concubines were known as nyogo, or koi, carefully ranked according to the emperor's favour. The imperial household functioned as both a sacred institution and a political chessboard. On the surface, these women lived lives of refinement, calligraphy, poetry, music, but underneath lay constant competition, because the stakes weren't just romance. A single son could secure an entire clan's fortune, while failure to attract the emperor's gaze meant fading into obscurity behind screens and sliding doors. Here's your solid historical fact. During the Heian period, 794 to 1185, the imperial court was dominated by women of the Fujiwara clan, who supplied daughters to emperors as consorts. Their influence wasn't subtle, it shaped succession, politics, and even literature. One of the greatest works of world literature, The Tale of Genji, written by Lady Murasaki Shikibu, emerged from this environment, a fictionalized mirror of the very intrigues and romances that pulsed through the court. Now for the quirky sparkle. Court life was so saturated with poetry that lovers often communicated almost entirely through verse. A concubine might send a poem written on a fan, or tied to a branch of blossoms, the imagery layered with hidden meaning. Imagine a whole romance played out in metaphors about cherry blossoms falling, or the cry of a distant bird. Even rejection had to be poetic. If the emperor ignored a verse, it was silence as sharp as any sword. And here's the scholarly debate. Were concubines truly free agents in shaping imperial policy, or were they instruments wielded by powerful families? Some historians argue that women like those of the Fujiwara clan intentionally cultivated intimacy as a way to secure dynastic dominance. Others suggest the women themselves were pawns, chosen for beauty and grace but lacking autonomy. The ambiguity lingers in the diaries and poems they left behind, texts that reveal both artistry and resignation, passion and duty. Picture a summer night in the palace gardens. Fireflies glow over still ponds, and the emperor walks slowly along the veranda, courtiers bowing low. Inside, a concubine waits, hair cascading in black waves that trail longer than her robes. She has prepared incense, chosen a poem, and adjusted her sleeves just so. The smallest details matter, each one a performance. When he finally enters, the atmosphere is thick with unspoken meaning. Their union will ripple outward, deciding not only her fate but her family's standing for generations. Yet behind the elegance, rivalries festered. Poisonings were whispered about, letters stolen, poems intercepted. A woman who caught the emperor's favour risked becoming the target of jealous rivals. Entire clans fought proxy wars through the bodies of their daughters, while the women themselves carried both the burden and the hope of dynastic ambition. The court, serene on the surface, was a storm beneath, and yet the beauty is undeniable. The diaries of Heian women capture moments of startling intimacy. A glimpse of the moon from a shuttered window, the brush of silk against a hand, the ache of waiting for footsteps that never came. These fragments remind you that beneath the politics, they were human, yearning, laughing, despairing, loving. Even surrounded by ritual, their emotions seeped onto paper like ink bleeding through silk. As you slide the shoji door closed, The faint scent of incense clings to your clothes, soft and bittersweet. The Japanese concubines leave you with a sense of quiet power, less flamboyant than Versailles, less brutal than the Ottoman harem, but no less decisive. In a world where poems could topple reputations and a single night could alter dynasties, intimacy was art and art was destiny. The corridor feels strange now, as if the centuries have suddenly collapsed. The torches fade into spotlights, the echo of footsteps replaced by the whir of film reels. You push open the next door and find yourself in Hollywood, 20th century America's palace of illusions, where queens no longer wear crowns of gold but tiaras of diamonds borrowed from jewelers, and mistresses are reborn as starlets shimmering on silver screens. Here, gossip columns replace pamphlets, studios replace palaces, and the throne is not a monarchy but the movie camera itself. Hollywood has always been an empire of desire. Just as Versailles paraded mistresses and the Forbidden City catalogued concubines, Hollywood created icons whose private lives became public property. The women here weren't called mistresses, they were leading ladies, starlets, or sometimes in whispers, the other woman. But their power followed the same ancient rhythm. Intimacy could make or break careers, toppled reputations, or elevate someone into legend. Here's your historical fact. Marilyn Monroe, perhaps the most iconic star of the mid-20th century, was rumoured to have had affairs with both John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert. Though definitive proof remains elusive, the rumours alone were enough to brand her as Hollywood's modern courtesan, a woman whose sexuality wasn't just entertainment but political dynamite. When she sang Happy Birthday, Mr. President in that glittering dress, it was less performance than provocation, a reminder that desire and power had not drifted far from palaces, they had just traded ermine for sequins. Now for the quirky sparkle, the old Hollywood studio system actually had departments dedicated to managing stars' scandals. If an actress became pregnant by a powerful man, the studio might arrange for her to vacation in Europe, only to return miraculously slimmer months later. Publicists acted like royal courtiers, spinning rumours into legends, burying affairs in sealed envelopes, and occasionally planting fake romances to distract from real ones. In its own way, Hollywood ran like a modern Versailles, with gossip as currency and desire as spectacle. And here's the scholarly debate. Were these starlets victims of a predatory system used for pleasure and discarded when their beauty faded? Or were they powerful players who understood the game and bent it to their will? Some scholars see women like Monroe as tragic pawns of an exploitative industry. Others argue they wielded their sexuality deliberately, leveraging intimacy into fame and fortune. The tension mirrors the debates about queens and mistresses centuries earlier, history repeating itself under brighter lights. Picture a Hollywood party in the 1950s. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and gin martinis, jazz drifting from a record player. Directors, senators, and producers mingle with women in satin gowns, their laughter carrying above the clinking of ice. A starlet slips out to the poolside with a politician, her sequined heels clicking against the tiles. Their whispers ripple outwards, soon to be captured in a gossip column or hinted at in a blind item. Like Versailles, everyone pretends not to notice, even as they notice everything. Behind the glamour, of course, came ruin. Scandals destroyed careers, an exposed affair, a leaked photo, or even rumours of improper sexuality. Women bore the brunt, their reputations shredded while their male counterparts often emerged unscathed. Yet some starlets refused to be broken. Mae West, with her bawdy wit, turned sex into comedy and defiance, quipping her way through censorship. Others, like Elizabeth Taylor, leaned into scandal, marrying and divorcing publicly, her passion as much a performance as her films. Hollywood, in its glitz and cruelty, wasn't so different from the courts of Europe. Desire was currency, and intimacy, whether whispered or shouted, became part of the brand. The actresses may not have worn crowns, but they ruled nonetheless. Over audiences, over lovers, over an industry that both consumed and worshipped them. As you leave the chamber of flashing bulbs and red carpets, the smell of cigarette smoke clings to you, sharper than incense or sandalwood. Hollywood's queens remind you that the role of mistress never vanished. It simply evolved, draped in silk and sequins, filmed in Technicolor, and broadcast to the world. The palace became a studio lot, the throne a director's chair. But the game, centuries old, stayed the same. The corridor twists again, and this time the walls feel modern. lined not with torches but with the flicker of paparazzi cameras. You push open the next door and step into the late 20th century, where the British monarchy, so practiced at staging dignity, stumbled into one of its most public love triangles. The air smells of perfume, fresh-cut flowers, and cold metal from camera flashes. Here stand Charles, Diana, and Camilla, bound together in a story that revealed to the world just how vulnerable even modern royals could be when love, sex, and scandal collided. When Charles married Lady Diana Spencer in 1981, it looked like a fairy tale. The shy kindergarten teacher transformed into a radiant princess in a gown with a 25-foot train. Millions watched the ceremony on television, the first global wedding event of its kind. But behind the lace and gold, cracks had already formed. Charles had never truly let go of his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, a woman he had loved before and continued to confide in even as he stood at the altar. Here's your historical fact. Diana herself admitted in her famous 1995 interview with the BBC that there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. That blunt acknowledgement tore away the facade of royal perfection and forced the world to confront the reality of the monarchy as a soap opera of flesh and blood. Now for the quirky sparkle, Diana was known to prank Charles, even early in their courtship, with playful humour. In one instance, she reportedly sent him a custard pie for his birthday, complete with a cheeky note. It was her way of cutting through the stiffness of royal life. Yet later, humour gave way to bitterness, as her loneliness grew and the shadow of Camilla loomed larger. The same woman who once laughed so easily became the princess photographed alone, head bowed, in front of the Taj Mahal. And here's the scholarly debate. Was Charles trapped by an outdated monarchy that forced him to marry a woman he didn't love, or was he simply unwilling to sacrifice personal desire for royal duty? Some argue Diana was a victim of a system that used her as a broodmare for heirs, never caring for her happiness. Others suggest she and Charles were mismatched from the start, different ages, different temperaments, and that Camilla represented not betrayal, but Charles's desperate reach for emotional compatibility. The arguments still rage because the wounds are still fresh. Imagine a night at Kensington Palace in the mid-80s. Diana, in a silk dressing gown, paces her rooms, the tabloids spread across her table, filled with insinuations about Camilla. Charles, in another wing, writes letters torn between duty and longing. Camilla, elsewhere, picks up the phone, her voice steady, her presence constant in Charles's life. The intimacy here isn't gilded with mystery, it's messy, raw, human. That very humanity is what shocked the world, used to thinking of royals as marble statues. The press devoured it. Secret phone calls between Charles and Camilla were leaked, one infamous transcript dubbed Camilla Gate, where the future king fantasized about being so close to her he wished he could be reincarnated as her tampon. Crude, human, embarrassing, and absolutely irresistible to tabloids. Diana, meanwhile, captured hearts as the wronged princess, the glamorous humanitarian whose pain was visible in every photograph. For once, a mistress wasn't hidden. She was front-page news, and yet history did what it always does. It shifted. Diana died tragically in 1990, leaving the monarchy shaken to its core. Charles and Camilla, after decades of whispers, eventually married in 2005. Today she stands as queen consort, her role legitimized after years of being vilified. The mistress became the queen, proving once more that in monarchy, scandal doesn't necessarily destroy, it sometimes simply evolves. As you step back into the corridor, the echoes of camera flashes linger, bright and harsh. This chapter reminds you that modern royalty may wear designer suits instead of ermine, but the old story remains. Desire collides with duty. Love triangles topple illusions, and the public consumes it all hungrily, whether in pamphlets, tabloids, or tweets. The crown may sparkle, but it cannot hide the tremors of the heart. The corridor narrows one last time, the torches flickering as though the walls themselves are whispering. You push open the final door and step into the present, a world where queens and mistresses no longer hide behind velvet curtains or marble walls, but live under the relentless glow of smartphones and social media. The scent here is modern. Designer perfume mixed with the sterile hum of flashing cameras, the digital ozone of gossip shared in real time. This is the stage of contemporary royalty, where every glance, every rumour, every touch is magnified into global scandal before breakfast. Today's queens, whether crowned monarchs like Queen Letizia of Spain, Queen Maxima of the Netherlands, or symbolic figures like Britain's Queen Camilla, walk a perilous tightrope. They're expected to embody tradition and moral authority while living in a world that can dissect a lipstick choice into political commentary. Their private lives are not just private, they're public property. A suspicious absence at an event, a fleeting smile at the wrong person, a whispered rumour from an anonymous palace insider, all can explode into headlines, memes, and conspiracy theories. Here's your historical fact fresh from recent memory. Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, described in interviews how tabloid obsession with her marriage to Prince Harry nearly broke her. The royal family's stiff expectations clashed with her desire for independence, and whispers about her private life grew into full-blown media wars. In stepping back from royal duties, Meghan and Harry exposed how modern monarchies remain trapped between centuries-old traditions and 24/7 global scrutiny. Now for the quirky sparkle. In Thailand, King Maha Vajiralongkorn made headlines in 2019 when he formally named an official royal consort, Sininat Wongvajirapakdi, alongside his queen. It was the first time in nearly a century that Thailand publicly acknowledged a royal mistress. Photos of Sininat in military fatigues and holding a jet pilot's helmet were even posted on the palace's official website, only to mysteriously vanish months later when she fell from favour. Imagine the centuries-old practice of naming a maîtresse en titre suddenly revived in the age of Instagram. It's both surreal and oddly fitting, and here's the scholarly debate of our own time. Do modern queens and consorts have more freedom than their predecessors, or are they even more trapped by image-making? Some argue today's women can shape their narratives, giving interviews, running charities, even rejecting tradition altogether. Others counter that the internet age is more ruthless than Versailles ever was, magnifying gossip into permanent digital scars. At least in the past, a scandalous pamphlet faded with time. Now, a rumour lives forever in the cloud. Imagine a modern royal bedroom. It isn't lit by candlelight, but by the glow of a phone screen at midnight. A queen scrolls through headlines about herself, heart sinking at the venom of comments. A mistress, perhaps a lover hidden in rumour alone, refreshes social feeds to see if their name has been dragged into the storm. Privacy is gone. Every absence, every unexplained trip becomes a puzzle for the public to solve. The palace walls may still stand, but they are transparent now, made of glass and pixels. And yet the old patterns remain. Power and passion still intertwine, even if their theatre has changed. Royals today may play their roles with more caution, but they are still human, and humanity is messy. The press still adores a candle, the public still devours whispers, and mistresses, whether confirmed, alleged, or entirely invented, remain characters in the ongoing soap opera of monarchy. As you close the last chamber, the echoes of centuries swirl around you: Cleopatra's perfumed barge, Catherine the Great's rumours, Versailles' mirrors, Hollywood's flashbulbs, Diana's broken heart. All the queens and mistresses you've met form a tapestry woven from desire, duty and scandal. And the lesson, whispered across ages, is simple. Crowns may change shape, but hearts remain stubbornly the same. After so many chambers, so many curtains pulled back, it's time to step out of the corridor entirely. You leave behind the perfumes, the scandals, the whispers of lovers and queens. The air grows cooler, cleaner, until you're back in your own quiet room. The hum of history fades into the softer hum of your fan, the steady rhythm of your own breathing. The truth is, the secret sex lives of queens and mistresses tell us less about lust than about power, about the strange and fragile ways humans cling to love, ambition and survival. Behind every crown and every scandal there was simply a person, longing, scheming, hoping, hurting. They remind you that even those who seemed untouchable were never immune to the tremors of the heart. So let the images drift away now, Cleopatra laughing on her golden barge, Catherine the Great scribbling letters by candlelight, Marie Antoinette bending beneath the weight of pamphlets, Diana's eyes glittering with both hope and sorrow. Let them fade like stars at dawn. You are safe here in your bed, no court, no gossip, no crown pressing on your head. Just the softness of your pillow, the steady rise and fall of your chest, the comfort of slipping gently into dreams. Close your eyes, breathe deep, and let history's queens and mistresses retreat to their jewelled chambers. Tomorrow they'll still be there in books and stories, but tonight they've told you enough.